So I'm the moderator. I'm Kunihiro Yamaoka from Kitazoto University in Kanagawa, Japan, and I would like to introduce Professor Sam Whittle. Sam is a senior consultant rheumatologist at Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Adelaide, South Australia, and senior lecturer at University of Adelaide, and an adjunct senior research fellow at Monash University. He helped establishing the Australia and New Zealand musculoskeletal clinical trial network called ANZMUSC. And he is also the practitioner fellow at that network, researching living evidence in musculoskeletal disease. And he has led the development of Australian living guideline for the pharmacological management of inflammatory arthritis. He is currently serving as the Vice President of Australian Rheumatology Association. And he's also a member of the Cochrane Musculoskeletal Editorial Board and sits on the steering committee of the South Australian statewide chronic pain clinical network. I hope he's ready. Okay. Developing recommendations in rheumatology. So we're thinking about updating the recommendation for APLAR. So it will be very interesting to hear his talk. So please, Sam.
Thank you very much. And again, it's a real pleasure to be invited to be here today, and a particular pleasure to be back here in Japan. So thank you for having me. So I want to talk very briefly about some of the work that we've been doing developing our Australian guidelines, and particularly how we've been trying to introduce some novel concepts into guideline development. So this is where I'm from. I'm from Australia. This is the indigenous map of Australia, and I live on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people in South Australia. These are my disclosures. So I get paid to be a clinician and I get paid to be a researcher, but I don't get paid by anyone else. But I'd particularly like to thank ANZMUSC, who have kept me on as their practitioner fellow for a long time and has really supported this work. Okay, so I'm going to use the term living evidence a lot in this talk, and I say living evidence a lot, but what do we mean by that, and why do we need living evidence? Well, let's give a little bit of background. So it's interesting, I use this slide a lot when I give this talk, and so it's particularly nice to be able to use this Hokusai print actually in Japan. And this is just one of the most wonderful images in the history of art. But what it represents here, the metaphor, is that it represents how we are being deluged by data in our clinical practice. And we need a way to deal with that deluge of data. So, and we've known this for a long time. So we've known that the amount of evidence that's being produced is increasing exponentially, and that it's impossible for the individual clinician to keep up with the amount of evidence that's being produced in order to use that in their clinical practice. We're long past the days when you could read all the trials yourself. So we need a way to hold back the tide. So this is King Canute, who very famously despaired that despite being the king and emperor of all he surveyed, he still couldn't hold back the tide. So how do we hold back this tide of data in modern medical practice? Well, one of the ways we do that is through systematic review. So systematic reviews have been around for a long time, and they're a great way of summarizing the evidence. The problem is that they take a long time to do. They involve a huge amount of work, and they're very slow. So there's evidence to show that it takes several years for most primary studies to end up in the systematic review. And that is not an optimal situation. And then when you finally do all the work and you get your systematic review published, it goes out of date really fast. So we know that within about 5 years, the majority of systematic reviews are no longer up to date. And in fact, 7% of systematic reviews are out of date on the day that they're published. So we need a better system. And so a variety of people, including Cochrane, have led the development of this living evidence approach to systematic review and guideline development. And so we talk a lot about doing living systematic reviews, and these have become a reality now, and we think that they'll become an increasingly important part of what we do. So what is a living systematic review? Well, it's pretty simple. It's actually just a normal systematic review, but it is developed in such a way as that it is continuously updated as new information becomes available. So the methods are relatively straightforward, in theory, they are harder to do in practice, but essentially you set up in advance your systematic review a set of systems to continuously scan the literature, and whenever relevant new information comes to light, that is immediately incorporated into the systematic review, and the findings are updated. This can be applied to any type of systematic review. It can be done to update a systematic review, or it can be done at the outset of a new systematic review. Now, this is also labor intensive and cost intensive, so we don't want to do it for every single systematic review that we do. So there are times when a living approach is more relevant than others. And essentially, a living systematic review is best when it's an important question, when there's uncertainty in the evidence around that question, and when new evidence is emerging, and that there's capacity to actually maintain the living systematic review. So that's systematic reviews, but what about guidelines? Guidelines is what I'm really interested in. So guidelines have been around for a long time, and they remain a really important part of the way we do our daily practice. But guidelines as well can go out of date really fast. So we know that about 1 in 5 recommendations in a guideline will be out of date within the first 3 years. And in fact, many guidelines also go out of date as soon as they're published. So a similar theory applies to guidelines as to systematic reviews about which questions to prioritize for a living approach. And so this flowchart comes from the recently published Australian Living Guidelines Handbook, which is freely available online. So if you're interested in this, you're welcome to go and check out our handbook, livingevidence.org.au. But really, the questions we want to put into living mode are those that are high priority for decision making. So the most important questions, those where we've got uncertainty, so new evidence is likely to change the recommendation, and those in which we've got some confidence that new evidence is actually going to emerge. So in light of this, we asked ourselves the question, well, what is the state of play in rheumatology? How much are guideline recommendations changing in rheumatology? So we had a look at all of the EULAR guidelines for 15 years from 2005 onwards. And the primary question we wanted to ask was, what proportion of recommendations within each of these EULAR guidelines? So we looked at every EULAR guideline that had at least one update in that 15-year period. And we asked ourselves, what proportion of those recommendations are what we called volatile? And volatile means from one edition to the next, they changed in such a way that would actually change your practice. And then we looked at, well, what might predict the volatility of the individual recommendations? And this is what we found. Across a couple of hundred recommendations, 45% of them, so almost half of the recommendations in EULAR guidelines were volatile, actually changed from one publication to the next. So that was actually a higher proportion than we expected. And what predicted it? Well, it was pretty much as we expected. So if you had high-level evidence underlying a recommendation, the odds of it changing were approximately half. But if there was new evidence emerging, new RCTs being published on that topic, then they were more likely to change. And the more RCTs that were published, the more likely they were to change. So what did we learn from that? Well, we learned that almost half of rheumatology recommendations are volatile. And so the current practice of periodically updating guidelines in rheumatology risks exposing clinicians to outdated recommendations between updates. So rheumatology is an ideal setting for living guidelines. And we know that the amount of emerging evidence is a really important determinant of that. So that's led to this, the development of the Australian Living Guideline for the management of inflammatory arthritis. And we've actually got 2 Australian Living Guidelines now, one for adult inflammatory arthritis and one for juvenile idiopathic arthritis. So when we started this project, this is how the guideline landscape looked. There are lots of guidelines in rheumatology. They all look different from each other. They're all published in different formats. They cover slightly different topics. There's no central data repository. So every time people start one of these projects, they start from scratch, identifying and extracting the data, which is inefficient. There's inefficiencies built throughout the current system and a lot of redundancy of effort. Systematic reviews are done over and over and over again. We also know that the current guidelines, which tend to be published in paper formats, penetrate pretty poorly actually to the point of care, to the end users. And then they're updated on either a kind of routine schedule every 3 to 5 years or on a kind of ad hoc schedule. And so they're often out of date. So this is what we've wanted to create. We've wanted to create guidelines that are based on a central, living, single data repository that everyone contributes to. And then we develop guidelines that have got a clear and unified guideline structure. The questions that are in living mode are prioritized to the needs of the guideline users. There's a system for moving recommendations in and out of living mode. We have guideline panels that can be assembled at very short notice. And then we use technology in a clever way to try and improve our systems for developing and implementing our recommendations. That we have a user interface that appropriately disseminates our recommendations to the point of care and contain aids not only for the prescriber, but also for the patient. And then in an ideal world, this living ecosystem of living guidelines and recommendations feeds back into the research agenda. So we've got a continuous research loop from identifying the research needs to performing the trials, to appraising the trials, incorporating them into recommendations, and again, identifying the gaps so that we continue to improve our research ecosystem. That's the goal. How are we doing? All right, let me show you what we've done so far, and then you can adjudicate me. So first, the living central data repository. So we've started working in our Australian group with the Canadian Rheumatology Association as a kind of example of how we can start cooperating across international boundaries to create a single repository of knowledge. And so this is our kind of keystone project, is we're doing a series of 3 linked Cochrane living network meta-analyses of DMARD therapy for rheumatoid arthritis. So we hope this is going to be the key resource for DMARDs going forward. And we've got 3 separate populations. We've divided it into the DMARD naive population, the conventional synthetic DMARD inadequate responder population, and the biological DMARD inadequate responder population. And we've been working on this project now for several years. We're very close to publishing the first of those 3 living network meta-analyses and systematic reviews. So the one we're closest to is actually our TNF inadequate responder group. So this is what the network map actually looks like for the ACR 50 outcome. It's a bit of an unusual looking map, but it's pretty well populated. And we've actually, both the Canadians and the Australians have contributed to this data set, and it's a living data set, and it will go on forever, we hope. And we've used this already to develop our first recommendation based on these data. Now, network meta-analyses are in fact a real challenge in themselves to present to guideline panel groups because the data are very dense. So we've been working with a group in Scandinavia who've developed a tool called the Match It tool. And I can't demonstrate this for you in a live sense, but this is an online tool for showing the result, all of the comparisons in a network meta-analysis in a way that's actually understandable. And it's an interactive web app. It's really cool. So that's still in the development phase, but we used it to develop our first recommendation based off these data. And so this is our recommendation about DMARD use in people with rheumatoid arthritis who have failed to respond to a TNF inhibitor. And you can find this in our living guideline at mskguidelines.org. It's there free for everyone to use. So that's our recommendation that came from those data. And in doing this, we've identified a number of innovations that are ongoing, but so far we've kind of tried to make it entertaining by calling it the 5 A's. So we think that the way that we want to work is we want to make things accessible. That means anyone can access the data and the results. So not only is our guideline free to use online, but all of our data are stored on the Open Science Framework. So people are welcome to use all of our extracted data. We've automated a number of steps, and I won't go into that today, but I'm happy to talk about it in more detail if you'd like. The alliances are this idea that everyone contributes to one data resource. So the mantra that we follow is global evidence for local recommendations. The whole concept of this is that anyone in the world who wants to participate in this project can contribute data and effort to extracting the data, storing the data, and analyzing the data. And then anyone can use that to form their own local recommendations, because clearly the Australian recommendations for the treatment of RA are going to be different to the Japanese recommendations for a number of reasons. But the data resource is the same. So we shouldn't have to keep extracting the data over and over again. We want these to be applicable, and we've actually atomized the tasks. So we've used we've actually used it crowdsourced some of the data extraction here and turned it into micro tasks, which has been a pretty cool innovation as well. Okay, so what's our unified guideline structure? How does it look? The beautiful thing about living guidelines is that you go one recommendation at a time. So you can actually build it in a modular fashion, one recommendation at a time as your resources allow. So this is the structure that we're starting to build. We've got the pharmacological management of adult inflammatory arthritis. We've got the management of JIA, and then we can build these other modules into it over time as resources become available. And this is really the key insight about what makes living guidelines so great, is that this is a graphical metaphor here. And if you look in panel A, if you imagine that as a single guideline containing a number of recommendations, which are the blue lines. And as those recommendations progress through time, some of them remain relevant, but some of them become out of date and they stop. So when should you update a complete guideline? If you do it early, like in panel B, then you've got a very valid guideline, but it's a very inefficient process. But if you wait as long as they wait in panel C, you've got a much cheaper process, but you've got invalid results. So the key insight to living guidelines is that the unit of update is the recommendation. So within a guideline modular structure, each individual recommendation is monitored for changes in the evidence base. And if evidence changes for one recommendation, that recommendation is updated in near real time. And then we publish it online, and this is what it looks like, mskguidelines.org. These are some of the recommendations we've got so far. We've got recommendations about analgesics. We've got recommendations related to COVID-19, use of glucocorticoids, perioperative management of DMARDs, and the like. And that will continue to build over time, and they're all continuously updated as we go. Okay, now prioritization of questions by guideline users. We only want to use the recommendations that are most important to users. So we've actually surveyed the Australian Rheumatology Association, and we've got a ranked list of 34 topics in order of preference for adults. And we've also got a top 10 for JIA. And that paper's already been published, and the adult paper's just in preparation at the moment. Now, agile guideline panels, in a way, we started this project thinking that we would probably meet in person, but we were caught out by this little virus that came along just as we started this project. And of all the horrors of the pandemic, the one benefit that we've identified is that we've learnt to do all of our guideline work online. So our guideline panels never met physically. And that has enabled a great deal of agility, which means we can convene a guideline panel like that and get together, and at very low cost. So that's been a bonus. And that's what our panel looks like at the moment. And then finally, the user interface. So we want to use technology to provide a user interface that's valuable to users. So if you go to the website, not only can you see the recommendation, but you can then click down, you can see all the data there. And this is all kept up to date in real time. So whenever we get new data, that summary of findings table gets updated. Users can click through to see how the guideline panel has actually made the decision to come up with a recommendation based on the data that are there. We also enumerate the rationale for why we've made the decisions that we've made, and that contains quite a lot of detail that's actually really useful for people who want to dig deeper. And then finally, we also contain some practical information steps for people who want to implement the recommendation at the point of care. This is what practical information looks like. And it's just some simple dot points on how to implement the recommendation. We've also made some patient-facing guides, including these decision aids. This is the one for our tapering of biological DMARDs. And we've also made some clinician-facing guides. This is the one for clinicians who want to talk to their patients about tapering biological and targeted synthetic DMARDs. So to conclude, we've got some green shoots of this ecosystem evolving. These are the living guidelines we're building, and we want to build some more. So we want guidelines that have questions that are relevant to the users of the guideline, that are based on a high quality synthesis of data that's always up to date from around the world, but are relevant to the users in their local context, that are freely accessible and actually useful at the point of care, and ultimately promote shared decision-making in the shared understanding of medicine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very attractive talk, and probably very attractive for a lot of people that are involved in making the recommendation. Please submit your questions, and first I will start. So I think it sounds very, very attractive, but who are the people that sort of, search and keep an eye on what comes out, and it is very, if it's really relevant to the recommendation?
Yeah, so we've got a team. So we've got a guideline development group that I lead, and within that we've got a data team or an evidence team. So we've got a librarian that we've employed on a small fraction, but she keeps us up to date with the searches. Then I've got a team of people who are continually going through and screening those searches, and then deciding if there's new evidence, then that comes back to us in the team, and we decide whether that's relevant and and the summary of findings needs to be updated. So we do that at least 3 monthly, which we think is the right time frame at the moment. That's quite a lot of work. And so we're continually looking for ways to try and streamline that, because as the guideline grows, the work also grows exponentially. But if we see a change in the evidence, then that doesn't necessarily trigger the guideline panel to be reconvened. It depends on some pre-specified thresholds. So for example, if we saw a change in the grade certainty of the evidence, or if we saw a change in the direction of the evidence, then that would trigger the guideline panel to be reconstituted to look at the recommendation. That happens relatively infrequently. What happens more often is that we get some data that updates a summary of findings table, but not in a way that would necessarily trigger a recommendation change. That summary of findings is then packaged up and sent out to our guideline panel by email to get a consensus. And then if anyone on the guideline panel thinks that we should actually meet to discuss it, then we'll do that. So there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes. It's resource intense, and that's another reason why I think we want to try to increase the amount of collaboration that we do, because I think many hands are likely to make light work.
And you can incorporate that to the local recommendation.
That's right.
But you also need some data from the local area. So is that what sort of rings a bell?
I think that's a really perceptive question, and that's one of the great difficulties. But we think what we want the shared resource to be is the synthesis of all the RCT evidence, because we think that that's a universal resource. Now, there may be, and we think everyone can contribute to that and everyone can use that. When we then go to a guideline panel, that data resource forms the center point of our deliberations, but not all of it. And so local contextual factors are then actually brought in at the local meeting. And that, I think, will vary by context. So there may be some context. For example, I think Japan's probably a good example where, we know that there are a number of RCTs that are done separately to the non-Japanese population and the Japanese population. So that may be where another layer of extra work would be needed. But we don't think that applies to every jurisdiction. We certainly think that there's no reason why the EULAR guidelines, the ACR guidelines, the Australian guidelines couldn't be based on the same evidence resource.
So we have one question that from Dr. Mahdi. I suggest the guideline and systemic reviews should be updated every year, but not by the same group, because new group may pay attention to points that neglected by the former group, and it is because of variability in rheumatology training and functional teaching doctor experiences.
That's a great question. There's no doubt that there is subjectivity in systematic review. You know, I mean, there's pretty good evidence that if you give the same data set to different researchers, they'll come to different conclusions. Mm-hmm. I think though that's an argument in favor of globalizing the resource. So the more contributors that we can have to a single resource. I mean, the data are the data. So the data needs to be identified and extracted. That should only ever be done once per trial. And then it should be in a resource that's perpetual. At the moment, people keep going back and doing the same searches and extracting the data from the same studies, and it's just such a waste of time. But I think having a kind of global input into the way those data are then interpreted is really important.
Okay, thank you very much. Oh, okay.
Sorry. It's very exciting and fascinating talk, Sam. So, and congratulations. So, I'm just want to ask whether you would also incorporate other RCT or other trial or data sources from other language based like Japanese, Chinese, and other, because these are globally that would be utilized ultimately.
Yeah, we're trying very hard not to have any language restrictions on our searches. It's difficult. So the searches don't have language restrictions. When we identify a non-English trial, we will do our best to include and extract those data. Sometimes that's easy and sometimes it's difficult, but I absolutely agree. It's vital that we have an overview of the totality of evidence in existence.
Thank you. It's very interesting. I noticed this was done using the MAGIC, and I noticed that WHO also used the same platform for the COVID-19. Is it free or what's the cost that's involved?
Magic App's not free, so it's a commercial endeavor, but it's run by people who are deeply embedded in the research evidence synthesis universe, by academics really, but because there's a lot of coding involved, that comes at a cost. So there is a license fee, and that varies. There are different ways of managing that, but that is an obstacle. Cost is always an obstacle to doing these things, and none of these things come free. And whenever we have to work with a commercial vendor, there are risks involved in that as well. But we think this is a platform that we trust and we think it's been around for a long time. There's a lot of other users in the space that are using it. So we're hoping, for example, we'd like to get a national license to use it, which we think is something that we can do. We've got a living evidence consortium in Australia now called ALAC, the Australian Living Evidence Consortium. So that consortium now is able to purchase a license, and we are in the process of trying to develop a global consortium that would act in a similar way.
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting talk. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you.
So we will have a 10-minute break and 10 minutes later, resume 10 minutes later. Thank you very much.